Charles II of Spain couldn't chew his own food. His tongue was so swollen it barely fit in his mouth, and his jaw jutted out so far that his teeth never met. When he died at 38, doctors found his heart was the size of a peppercorn, and his body had rotted from the inside out. But here's what's truly terrifying. He wasn't the worst case of royal inbreeding in history. If you think the Habsburgs were monsters, wait until you hear what happened when other royal families decided to keep their bloodlines pure. Subscribe now, because this rabbit hole goes deeper than you think. Much deeper. Madrid, November 1661. When the midwives first saw the newborn prince, they went silent. The infant who had become Charles II of Spain entered the world with a head too large for his body and a face that seemed to collapse in on itself. His mother, Queen Mariana, wept not with joy, but with something closer to horror. The royal physicians exchanged glances, but wrote nothing in their reports. They knew better than to document what they were seeing. For the first 8 years of his life, Charles could not walk. His legs simply would not bear his weight. Servants carried him everywhere through the vast halls of the royal Alcazar, while other children his age ran and played. His nurses had to feed him by hand because his motor control was so poor that he would choke on his own food. When he finally did learn to walk, it was with a stumbling, unsteady gait that never improved. Courtiers learned to look away, but walking was the least of his problems. Charles had inherited something far worse than weak legs. He had inherited the biological consequences of 2 centuries of deliberate matrimonial strategy. His family had pursued a single goal with ruthless consistency: keep power within the bloodline. Marry cousins to cousins. Marry uncles to nieces. Never let foreign blood dilute the pure Habsburg line. For 16 generations, they had succeeded in concentrating power. They had also succeeded in concentrating something else. The Spanish court began calling him El Hexizado, the bewitched, the hexed one. It was easier to blame witchcraft than to confront the truth. Priests performed exorcisms. Healers tried every remedy known to medieval medicine. Nothing worked because the problem was not supernatural. It was written into every cell of his body, copied and recopied through generations of marriages between relatives so close they were genetically nearly identical. Charles's father and mother were uncle and niece. His grandmother was simultaneously his aunt. His family tree did not branch outward like a normal family. It twisted back on itself in loops and knots, the same names appearing over and over in different positions. If you traced his ancestry back far enough, you would find that he had far fewer unique ancestors than a common peasant in the streets below his palace. The courtiers who whispered about curses were not entirely wrong. Charles was cursed, but not by witches or demons. He was cursed by mathematics, by the cold logic of genetics that his family had violated for 200 years. Every recessive disorder, every harmful mutation, every genetic flaw that might have disappeared in a normal population had been preserved, concentrated, and amplified in his DNA. He was not bewitched. He was the inevitable conclusion of an experiment in human breeding that should never have been attempted. And his suffering had only just begun. To understand what happened to Charles, you have to go back, not 1 generation, not 2, but 16. Back to the year 1516, when the Habsburgs first claimed the Spanish throne and made a decision that would echo through the centuries. They would marry only their own. It started subtly. First cousins marrying first cousins. Acceptable by the standards of the time, even common among royalty. But the Habsburgs did not stop there. They refined the practice into a science. Every marriage was calculated, planned, designed to keep wealth and power circulating within an ever-tightening circle of relatives. Other royal families occasionally married cousins. The Habsburgs made it their defining strategy. By the 1550s, the pattern had intensified. Philip II married his own niece. Their children married their cousins, who then produced children who married even closer relatives. Generation after generation, the genetic pool shrank. In most populations, harmful genes get diluted over time, masked by healthy variants from unrelated partners. In the Habsburg line, there was no dilution. There was only concentration. Scientists who later studied the Habsburg family records discovered something remarkable. Out of every 100 marriages in the dynasty, 82 were between blood relatives closer than third cousins. Imagine flipping a coin 100 times and getting heads 82 times. That is not chance. That is systematic. The consequences appeared slowly at first. A child born with a slightly enlarged jaw here. An infant who died within weeks there. The family buried these problems in royal crypts and moved forward, but genetics does not forget. Every hidden disorder, every recessive mutation, every flaw was being preserved and passed down, waiting for the right combination to express itself fully. In ordinary Spanish villages of the same era, about 20% of children died before their 5th birthday. Tragic, but a reality of the time. In the Habsburg family, that number climbed to 50%. Half of all children born to the dynasty died young. Their own family records documented this, yet the marriages continued. Power was more important than survival. By the time Charles's parents wed, the genetic damage had reached a critical threshold. When researchers centuries later calculated his inbreeding coefficient, a measure of how genetically similar his parents were, they found something shocking. The number was equivalent to what you would expect from a child born to a brother and sister, not cousins. Not uncle and niece, which his parents actually were. The accumulated inbreeding from previous generations had pushed his genetics into territory that should be biologically impossible for a living human. Charles was not an anomaly. He was not the result of bad luck or divine punishment. He was the mathematical endpoint of a genetic equation that had been building for 16 generations. His family had essentially been breeding him for 2 centuries. Though they did not know it. Every great-grandparent who married a cousin, every strategic alliance between relatives, every decision to keep the bloodline pure, had led directly to the broken body of the infant prince lying in the royal nursery. Unable to walk, unable to speak clearly, unable to chew. Charles reached adulthood, though no one had expected him to. By his 20th birthday, the young king faced responsibilities that would challenge any monarch. He was supposed to rule the largest empire on earth. Spanish territories stretched from the Americas to the Philippines. Millions of subjects looked to Madrid for leadership. But Charles could barely rule his own body. His jaw protruded so severely that his upper and lower teeth never touched. Chewing was impossible. His meals had to be softened to near liquid consistency, and even then he struggled. His tongue, swollen and oversized, made speech nearly incomprehensible. Foreign ambassadors who met with him had to bring translators, not for language barriers, but simply to decode what the King of Spain was trying to say. Council meetings became exercises in patience as ministers waited for Charles to form words that often never came clearly. But the physical challenges were only part of his burden. Charles suffered from episodes that court physicians called fits. Modern doctors would recognize them as epileptic seizures. They struck without warning, sending him convulsing to the floor, while terrified servants rushed to keep him from swallowing his tongue. Between episodes, he endured constant infections. His immune system, weakened by generations of genetic similarity, could not fight off even minor illnesses that healthy people shrugged off. The Spanish Empire needed an heir. At 15, Charles was married to Marie Louise of Orleans, a French princess who arrived at the Spanish court expecting to become a mother and secure the dynasty. She found instead a husband who could barely function. For 10 years she tried. 10 years of physicians examining her, priests blessing her, the entire court watching and waiting for news of a pregnancy that never came. The problem was not with Marie Louise. Charles was impotent, Another consequence of the genetic catastrophe coded into his cells. When Marie-Louise died in 1689, the court scrambled to find another bride. Charles married again, this time to Maria Anna of Neuburg. The same pattern repeated. The same desperate hope for an heir. The same inevitable disappointment. Maria Anna would later write letters describing her husband's condition in terms that mixed pity with horror. She spoke of a man who seemed mentally trapped somewhere between childhood and senility, who needed constant care, who was king in title but incapable of genuine rule. The Spanish court functioned around him, not because of him. Ministers made decisions and presented them for his approval, which he gave with a nod or a gesture because speaking remained difficult. Foreign powers began circling, sensing weakness. Everyone knew what the physicians dared not say openly. Charles would produce no children. The Spanish Habsburg line would die with him. He lived each day in a body that fought against him. Simple acts that others took for granted, walking across a room, eating a meal, holding a conversation, demanded immense effort. He had not chosen this existence. He had inherited it, along with a crown that sat on a head too large and a jaw that would not close. October 1700. Charles II lay dying in the royal bedchamber of Madrid. He was 38 years old, but looked ancient. His breathing came in shallow gasps. The same physicians who had attended him since birth stood helpless, knowing their patient was slipping away, and there was nothing left to try. They had tried everything over the decades. Remedies, bloodletting, prayers, exorcisms. None of it had worked, because none of it could undo what 16 generations had created. On November 1st, Charles died. The Spanish Empire, the most powerful domain in Europe, suddenly had no king and no heir. The throne sat empty. 2 centuries of careful marriage planning, all designed to keep power consolidated within one family, had produced exactly the opposite result. The line had extinguished itself. But the story does not end with his death. It ends with what the royal physicians found when they performed the autopsy. Court protocol demanded it. The king's body had to be examined, documented, and prepared for burial. What they discovered, they recorded in clinical detail that survives in archives to this day. The report makes for disturbing reading. Charles's heart was, in their words, the size of a peppercorn. Shrunken, barely functional, it had somehow kept him alive for nearly 4 decades. His lungs were described as corroded. His intestines were putrefied, showing signs of chronic disease that had plagued him throughout life. His liver was damaged beyond recognition. But perhaps most telling was what they found when examining his reproductive system. He had a single testicle, and it was described as black as coal. The physicians who wrote this report were not trying to be shocking. They were simply documenting what generations of concentrated genetics had produced. This was not a body that had been ravaged by disease or poison, though rumors of both circulated through Madrid. This was a body that had been constructed, piece by piece, through centuries of marriages between relatives, too closely related to produce healthy offspring. Within weeks of Charles's death, European powers went to war over who would claim the Spanish throne. The War of Spanish Succession would rage for over a decade, killing hundreds of thousands. Entire nations fought for control of an empire that a single family had controlled through bloodline alone. The Habsburgs had guarded their inheritance so jealously, had protected it so carefully through strategic marriages, that when the last of them died, there was no one left to inherit it peacefully. Scientists centuries later would study the Habsburg family records and confirm what the autopsy suggested. By Charles's generation, the accumulated inbreeding had reduced the family's chances of survival by nearly 20% compared to the general population. The strategy that was supposed to preserve their power had destroyed it instead. Charles II was the end result of the most extreme case of royal inbreeding in European history. His suffering, his early death, and the extinction of his dynasty became a warning written in genetic code. But other royal families across the world were conducting their own experiments in bloodline purity, and some of them went even further. If you thought the Habsburgs took inbreeding to its limit, you were wrong. At least they drew the line somewhere. Uncles married nieces. First cousins married first cousins. But even the Habsburgs, with all their genetic recklessness, avoided one final boundary. They did not marry their own brothers and sisters. That distinction belongs to another royal dynasty, one that ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, and made sibling marriage not just acceptable, but mandatory. The year was 305 BC. Alexander the Great had died, and his empire was being carved up by his generals. One of them, Ptolemy, claimed Egypt as his prize. He founded a dynasty that would become one of the longest-lasting royal families in ancient history. The Ptolemaic rulers would sit on the throne of the pharaohs for 275 years, longer than the United States has existed as a nation. And for most of that time, they practiced something that would make even the Habsburgs recoil. Brothers married sisters, not distant relatives, not cousins separated by a generation or two. Full biological siblings, born of the same mother and father, raised in the same palace, sleeping in the same nursery as children. Then, when they came of age, they were married to each other and expected to produce the next generation of rulers. The Ptolemies did not stumble into this practice by accident or necessity. They chose it deliberately, modeling themselves after the ancient Egyptian gods Osiris and Isis, who were also brother and sister, also husband and wife. The royal family believed this made them divine, set apart from ordinary humans who followed ordinary rules. They were not merely kings and queens. They were living gods, and gods did not dilute their blood with mortals. For 10 generations, this continued. Ptolemy II married his full sister Arsinoe. Their descendants followed the same pattern. The family tree became a family ladder, straight up and down with almost no branches extending outward. Where the Habsburgs had slowly concentrated their genetics over 16 generations of cousin marriages, the Ptolemies did it immediately and absolutely with each brother-sister pairing. The most famous member of this dynasty was Cleopatra VII. The woman history remembers as simply Cleopatra. Shakespeare wrote plays about her. Hollywood made her a legend. But what popular history often glosses over is this. Cleopatra married her own brother, Ptolemy XIII, when she was 18 and he was 10. It was not romantic. It was not a love story. It was law. The throne required it. When that brother-husband tried to overthrow her, leading to civil war, she had him killed and married her younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, another sibling, another husband, another political necessity wrapped in the language of divine bloodline. This was not an empire that occasionally bent the rules of consanguinity. This was a dynasty that rewrote those rules entirely, that treated full sibling incest as official royal policy for longer than most civilizations survive. And the consequences were far worse than deformity or disease. The Ptolemies had created something darker. The physical effects of sibling marriage appear gradually across generations. A weakened immune system here, fertility problems there, subtle at first. But the Ptolemies discovered something that the Habsburgs never quite reached. When you compress a bloodline that tightly, that quickly, the damage goes beyond the body. It invades the mind. Paranoia became a family trait. Not the clinical kind that physicians might diagnose, but a rational response to living in a palace where your brother was both your husband and your greatest threat to power, where your sister-wife might decide she wanted the throne for herself, where every family dinner was a potential conspiracy, every private conversation a possible plot. The Ptolemaic dynasty did not just practice inbreeding. It perfected political murder. Sibling killed sibling with such regularity that it became unremarkable. The palace in Alexandria was not merely a seat of government. It was an arena where family members circled each other like predators, waiting for weakness, planning elimination. Consider Ptolemy VIII, who came to power in the 2nd century BC. He did not inherit the throne peacefully. He murdered his nephew, the previous king, and seized control. Then he married his nephew's widow, who was also his own sister. For a time, this arrangement held. But when their son grew old enough to be seen as a rival, Ptolemy VIII had the boy killed, his own child, his sister's son, eliminated because he represented a future threat. This was not madness in the conventional sense. This was the logical outcome of a system where family and power were so intertwined that they became indistinguishable. When your spouse is also your sibling, and your children are products of that union, and those children will eventually want the throne you sit on, trust becomes impossible. The genetic consequences compounded the political ones. Researchers who have studied the Ptolemaic family records note something curious. Fertility rates dropped with each generation. Pregnancies became harder to achieve. Infant mortality climbed. The very practice meant to preserve the bloodline was slowly sterilizing it. Couples who should have been in their prime childbearing years struggled to conceive. Those who did conceive often lost children in infancy. But unlike the Habsburgs, where the genetic damage manifested primarily in physical deformity, the Ptolemies seemed to suffer more subtle degradation. They could walk, they could speak, they could appear functional to outside observers. Alexandria remained a center of culture and learning. The library flourished. Trade continued. To the Greek and Roman observers who visited Egypt, the Ptolemies looked like any other royal family. What those observers could not see was what happened inside the palace walls. The whispered plots. The sudden disappearances of princes and princesses who fell out of favor. The quiet poisonings. The convenient accidents. A family that had made sibling marriage its defining feature had also made sibling rivalry a blood sport. By the time Cleopatra took the throne, she was inheriting not just an empire, but a legacy of 3 centuries of genetic and psychological compression. She was brilliant, politically savvy, and ruthless when she needed to be. But she was also the product of 10 generations of brothers marrying sisters. And her reign would prove that even brilliance cannot overcome the mathematics of a collapsing gene pool forever. When Cleopatra VII took the throne in 51 BC, she was 18 years old and already trapped. Egyptian law demanded she could not rule alone. She needed a co-ruler, a male partner to legitimize her authority. Her father had just died, leaving behind several children. The priesthood and the royal advisors made the decision for her. She would marry Ptolemy XIII, her younger brother. He was 10 years old. For 3 years, this arrangement existed in name only. Cleopatra ruled while her child husband sat beside her in ceremonies, too young to understand the politics swirling around him. But Ptolemy XIII had advisors of his own, powerful men who saw an opportunity. They whispered in the boy's ear as he grew older. They told him he was king, not just a figurehead. They convinced him his sister-wife was trying to sideline him, to take all the power for herself. By 48 BC, the tension had become a crisis. Ptolemy's advisors made their move. They turned the Egyptian military against Cleopatra, forcing her to flee Alexandria. The queen who had ruled Egypt found herself exiled from her own capital, driven out by her own brother-husband, hunted by soldiers who had once protected her. She escaped to Syria and began gathering forces for a counterstrike. This was the situation when Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria, pursuing his rival Pompey in Rome's own civil war. He found in Egypt tearing itself apart, sibling fighting sibling for a throne they were supposed to share. The legend says Cleopatra had herself smuggled into Caesar's presence, rolled up in a carpet, but the reality was more pragmatic. She needed a powerful ally, and Rome's greatest general needed Egypt's wealth. They formed an alliance that would reshape the Mediterranean world. The war between Cleopatra and her brother-husband turned Alexandria into a battleground. The famous library caught fire during the fighting. Priceless scrolls burned. When the conflict finally ended, Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile, trying to escape Caesar's forces. He was 15 years old. Egyptian law still required Cleopatra to have a male co-ruler. She married her remaining younger brother, Ptolemy XIV. He was 12. This marriage was even more transparent than the first. Cleopatra held all real power now, backed by Roman legions. Her new brother-husband was purely ceremonial. 3 years later, Ptolemy XIV died, suddenly under mysterious circumstances. Right around the time Cleopatra needed to elevate her son with Caesar to co-ruler status instead. The pattern was clear. 10 generations of mandatory sibling marriage had created a political system where family bonds meant nothing. Your brother was not your protector or companion. He was either your puppet or your enemy. Your sister wife was not your partner. She was competition for singular control. The throne could not be shared, despite the law demanding exactly that. Cleopatra was brilliant enough to navigate this impossible situation, but even she could not escape what the Ptolemaic system had become. A dynasty built on sibling marriage had transformed family into a perpetual civil war, and Egypt paid the price in instability, violence, and eventual collapse. Here is the question that puzzled historians and geneticists for centuries. How did the Ptolemaic dynasty survive for 275 years? The Habsburgs practiced far less extreme inbreeding, just cousin marriages primarily, and their line collapsed in genetic ruin within 16 generations. The Ptolemies married full siblings for 10 consecutive generations, and somehow continued. The mathematics alone suggests they should have destroyed themselves within a few cycles. Yet they endured longer than almost any other Hellenistic dynasty. The answer lies not in who survived, but in who did not. For every Ptolemaic ruler who made it to adulthood and claimed the throne, there were dozens of siblings, cousins, and royal children who simply vanished from the historical record. Infant mortality in the dynasty was catastrophic. Palace records that survive hint at pregnancies that ended in stillbirth. Children who died within days of birth. Young princes and princesses who never saw their 5th birthday. The dynasty survived through brutal natural selection. The most severe genetic combinations, the ones that would have produced children as damaged as Charles II, killed their victims before they could reproduce. Only the relatively healthier offspring, the ones lucky enough to inherit slightly better genetic combinations, lived long enough to continue the line. The Ptolemies were not defying the laws of genetics. They were paying an enormous hidden price in lost children that the historical record barely mentions. This created a feedback loop. Each generation, the most damaged individuals died young. The survivors, while still products of sibling marriage, were genetically viable enough to function. They married their own siblings, producing another generation where the worst cases died and the less damaged survived. Over 10 generations, this process created a population that had, in a sense, purged some of its most lethal recessive genes simply by killing the carriers before they could pass those genes forward. But survival came with permanent scars. The psychological toll of growing up in a family where siblings were also spouses and rivals never diminished. The political instability remained constant. The fertility problems that plagued later generations suggested the genetic foundation was crumbling, even if it had not yet collapsed entirely. When Cleopatra died in 30 BC, the Ptolemaic dynasty ended with her. She had taken her own life rather than be paraded through Rome as a captive. Her children with Mark Antony were either killed or disappeared into obscurity. Egypt became a Roman province. The great experiment in sibling marriage was over. The dynasty had lasted not because sibling marriage was sustainable, but because the cost of that practice was hidden in unmarked graves and unrecorded deaths. For every pharaoh who sat on the throne, there were countless royal children who never got the chance. The Ptolemies did not prove that extreme inbreeding could work. They proved that it could be survived, barely, if you were willing to sacrifice enough lives along the way. And yet, even this was not the worst case of royal inbreeding in history. Other dynasties would take the practice to even darker extremes, with consequences that made the Ptolemies look almost restrained by comparison. The year was 1922. British archaeologist Howard Carter stood at the entrance to a tomb in Egypt's Valley of the Kings, peering into darkness that had remained undisturbed for over 3,000 years. When he finally broke through the sealed doorway, he found something the world had never seen: a pharaoh's burial chamber, intact and untouched by grave robbers. Inside lay the mummified remains of Tutankhamun, the boy king who had ruled Egypt and died mysteriously at just 19 years old. For decades, Tutankhamun's death remained a mystery wrapped in speculation. Some theorized murder. Others suggested accident. The truth would not emerge until 2010, when scientists finally performed a complete DNA analysis on his mummy and the remains of his family members. What they discovered was more disturbing than any murder plot. Tutankhamun had not been killed by enemies or political rivals. He had been doomed from the moment of conception. The DNA results revealed that Tutankhamun's parents were full brother and sister, not the distant cousins of the Habsburg line, not uncle and niece. His mother and father shared the same parents, grew up in the same royal household, and then produced a son together. That son became one of Egypt's most famous pharaohs, his golden death mask, an icon recognized around the world. But behind that mask was a face twisted by genetic catastrophe. When researchers examined Tutankhamun's mummy using modern CT scanning technology, they found deformities that would have made his brief life a constant struggle. His spine curved abnormally. One foot was clubbed, turned inward at an angle that would have made walking without assistance nearly impossible. Over 100 walking sticks were found in his tomb, not ceremonial objects, but practical tools that a teenage king needed just to move through his palace. His skull showed signs of a severe overbite. His hips were malformed. But perhaps most telling was what they found in his chest cavity. Tutankhamun's ribs were partially fused, and one side of his rib cage had not developed properly. This was not injury or disease. This was a body that had been constructed incorrectly from the beginning, following blueprints written in damaged genes. The ancient Egyptians, who prepared his body for burial and laid him to rest in that golden tomb, had no understanding of genetics or DNA. They could not have known that the practice of pharaohs marrying their sisters, a tradition meant to preserve divine bloodlines, was systematically destroying those bloodlines instead. They saw only a young king who walked with difficulty, who seemed frail despite his royal status, who died far too young. Tutankhamun ruled for less than a decade. He tried to father heirs with his wife, who was also his half-sister, continuing the pattern that had created him. 2 pregnancies resulted. Both ended in stillbirth. The mummified remains of those infants were buried with him, 2 tiny coffins holding children who never drew breath. The genetic damage had become so severe that even producing living offspring was no longer possible. 3,000 years before Charles II, ancient Egypt had already discovered what happens when royal families take inbreeding to its absolute extreme. To understand what destroyed Tutankhamun, you have to understand his father. Akhenaten was one of the most controversial pharaohs in Egyptian history, a ruler who tried to overturn 3,000 years of religious tradition and replace Egypt as many gods with worship of a single deity. He moved the capital, renamed himself, and rebuilt Egyptian society according to his vision. He also looked strange. Ancient Egyptian art typically portrayed pharaohs as idealized figures, perfect and godlike. But Akhenaten's portraits show something different: an elongated skull, a protruding belly, feminine hips, thin limbs. For years, scholars debated whether these images were symbolic or literal. The DNA evidence suggests they were disturbingly literal. Akhenaten carried genetic disorders that manifested in visible physical abnormalities, disorders that he would pass directly to his son, because Akhenaten married his own sister. Multiple times, in fact. The Egyptian royal family of the 18th dynasty had been practicing sibling marriage for generations, but Akhenaten took it further. When he produced a son with his sister wife, that child inherited a double dose of every harmful gene both parents carried. That child was Tutankhamun. The boy king inherited more than a throne. He inherited his father's genetic damage, compounded by another generation of inbreeding. The malformed foot, the curved spine, the fragile bones, all came directly from family decisions made long before he was born. But genetics was not the only thing slowly killing him. When scientists analyzed tissue samples from Tutankhamun's mummy, they found traces of malaria. Not just evidence of past infection, but active disease at the time of death. His weakened immune system, compromised by generations of inbreeding, could not fight off infections that a healthy person might have survived. Every illness hit him harder. Every fever lasted longer. His body had no reserves to draw on. The final months of his life likely involved pain that modern medicine can only imagine. That clubbed foot had developed a bone disease, possibly from repeated injury or infection. He was essentially walking on damaged bone, each step an agony. The walking sticks found in his tomb were not just aids for balance. They were necessities for a teenager who could barely stand. When he died at 19, the exact cause was probably not one thing but everything. The malaria burning through his blood, a bone disease in his foot, the general frailty of a body built from two similar genetic instructions. His system simply gave out, too compromised to continue. The priests who buried him did so hastily. His tomb was small, likely meant for someone else, and repurposed. Within a few generations, the location was forgotten. Later, pharaohs tried to erase his father's heretical religious revolution from history, and Tutankhamun got erased along with it. For 3,000 years, he lay forgotten in that small tomb, while other pharaohs were remembered in temples and monuments. The irony is crushing. Tutankhamun is now the most famous pharaoh in history, his golden mask recognized worldwide. But he achieved that fame not through his accomplishments or his power. He became famous because his tomb survived, and his tomb survived only because he was forgotten. The boy king who could barely walk, whose own body betrayed him, achieved immortality by accident. Tutankhamun married at age 8. His bride was Ankhse's-Nemun, daughter of Akhenaten, which made her Tutankhamun's half-sister. She was slightly older, perhaps 11 or 12. Neither child had chosen this marriage. It was arranged by the priests and advisors who actually ran Egypt, while the boy king sat on the throne, struggling with a body that barely functioned. For years, this marriage existed as pure political theater. Two children playing the roles of divine king and queen, while adults made every real decision. But as Tutankhamun reached his teenage years, the pressure mounted for them to produce an heir. The dynasty needed continuity. Egypt needed a future pharaoh. The priests needed legitimacy for the next generation. Ankhsenemun became pregnant. The entire court must have celebrated. Finally, after years of waiting, the royal line would continue. But when the child was born, it did not survive. The mummy of this infant, buried with Tutankhamun in his tomb, shows severe deformities. Spina bifida, a curved spine. A body that could never have lived outside the womb for more than hours, if that. She became pregnant again. Hope renewed itself. Perhaps the first pregnancy had been an unfortunate accident. Perhaps this time would be different. It was not. The second child was also born dead, or died immediately after birth. This infant's mummy showed similar catastrophic developmental problems. The genetic damage that had weakened Tutankhamun, that had killed his siblings, that had come down through generations of royal inbreeding, had now made reproduction itself impossible. Imagine being Anxizneman in those moments, barely into her teenage years, married to her half-brother, watching him slowly deteriorate from illness and genetic disorders, trying desperately to produce a child that could survive, and failing twice. The political implications were enormous. Without an heir, the dynasty faced crisis. But the personal toll must have been devastating. After the second stillbirth, there would have been no third pregnancy. Tutankhamun died not long after, his already fragile health finally giving out completely. Ankhesenamun found herself a teenage widow with no children, no protection, and no clear path forward. Egyptian records suggest she was forced to marry Ai, one of the elderly advisors who had effectively ruled Egypt during Tutankhamun's reign. Then she vanished from history entirely, her fate unknown. The throne passed to military commanders, not royal blood. The 18th dynasty, which had ruled Egypt for over 2 centuries, which had built some of the greatest monuments in Egyptian history, which had conquered territories and amassed unimaginable wealth, effectively ended with a teenager who could not walk properly and could not produce living children. The 2 tiny mummies, buried with Tutankhamun, tell a story more tragic than any murder mystery. They represent the endpoint of a genetic experiment that Egypt's royal family had been running for generations. Brother-sister marriages, meant to keep the bloodline pure and divine, had instead rendered that bloodline incapable of continuing. The practice designed to ensure the dynasty's survival had guaranteed its extinction. Egypt would have other dynasties, other pharaohs, but the direct line from Akhenaten through Tutankhamun died in that tomb with 3 bodies, a crippled king and 2 children who never had a chance. When researchers completed the DNA analysis of Tutankhamun and his family in 2010, they did not stop with just the boy king. They analyzed 11 royal mummies from the 18th dynasty, building a genetic family tree that revealed the full scope of what ancient Egypt's royal family had done to itself. The results showed that Tutankhamun was not an isolated case. He was the culmination of a pattern that had been destroying the dynasty for generations. 5 consecutive generations of the 18th dynasty practiced inbreeding at levels that modern genetics considers catastrophic. Fathers married daughters. Brothers married sisters. Uncles married nieces. The genetic diversity that protects populations from inherited disorders simply did not exist in this family. Every pharaoh was essentially breeding with a genetic copy of themselves, generation after generation. The DNA evidence revealed something even more disturbing. Many of the royal mummies showed signs of genetic disorders that would have caused chronic pain and disability. Akhenaten was not unique in his deformities. Multiple family members carried similar markers for bone disorders, hormonal imbalances, and immune deficiencies. The difference was that most of them did not leave behind detailed artistic portraits, so history forgot their suffering. This explains why the 18th dynasty, despite producing some of Egypt's most powerful pharaohs, like Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, eventually collapsed. The early generations, before the most extreme inbreeding began, were strong and capable. They built an empire. But as the practice intensified, each generation became weaker. By Tutankhamun's time, the royal line had degraded to the point where basic biological functions like walking and reproduction were compromised. What makes Tutankhamun's case more extreme than even Charles II is the directness of the inbreeding. Charles was the product of 16 generations of cousin marriages, a slow accumulation of genetic damage. Tutankhamun was the direct product of brother-sister union. The genetic impact was immediate and severe. Where Charles lived to 38, despite his deformities, Tutankhamun barely made it to 19. The walking sticks in his tomb, the evidence of bone disease, the stillborn children, all point to a young man whose body was failing in multiple ways simultaneously. Modern doctors who have studied his remains suggest he likely suffered constant pain. The malaria that finally killed him was just one infection among many that his compromised immune system could not handle. Ancient Egyptian religion taught that pharaohs were living gods, divine beings whose blood must remain pure. The priests who enforced sibling marriage believed they were preserving something sacred. They had no way of knowing they were conducting a genetic experiment that would inevitably fail. They could see the physical results, the deformities, the early deaths, the stillborn children, but they had no framework to understand cause and effect. Tutankhamun's golden mask hides a face that knew suffering. His treasures, meant to accompany him into the afterlife, include dozens of walking aids, because even in death, those who prepared his body understood he could not walk unaided. The boy king became a monster, not through cruelty or evil, but through biology. His family's devotion to bloodline purity created something that should never have existed. A pharaoh built from broken genes, doomed from conception, and incapable of continuing the very bloodline he was meant to preserve. The Hawaiian Islands, isolated in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, developed a culture completely independent of Europe and Egypt. No contact with the Ptolemies. No knowledge of the Habsburgs. Yet the Hawaiian royal class, the Alai, arrived at the same conclusion. The highest form of royalty required the closest form of inbreeding. They called the children of brother-sister unions Niopo, and these children were considered so sacred that commoners had to prostrate themselves or be executed if they stood in the child's presence. This was not occasional practice. This was systematic breeding designed to create divine rulers. The Alai believed that Mane's spiritual power flowed through bloodlines. The more concentrated the bloodline, the more powerful the mana. A child born from two unrelated nobles had some mana. A child born from cousins had more. But a child born from a brother and sister who were themselves born from siblings, that child possessed mana so potent they were essentially living gods. The most famous example was Nahianaena, born in 1815 to King Kamehameha I. She was betrothed from childhood to her full brother Kauikoli, who would become Kamehameha III. This was not arranged by priests or advisors acting against the siblings' wishes. Hawaiian culture celebrated such unions. The siblings themselves were raised knowing they would marry, that their union would produce the most sacred child Hawaii had ever seen. But by the time Nahianaena and Kauikoli reached adolescence, Western missionaries had arrived in Hawaii. These Christian missionaries were horrified by the practice of royal sibling marriage. They called it sinful, unnatural, an abomination before God. They pressured the Hawaiian royalty to abandon the tradition that had defined their nobility for centuries. Nahianaena found herself trapped between two worlds. Hawaiian tradition demanded she marry her brother and produce a Niopo heir. Christian teaching, which she had been educated in, told her this was deeply wrong. The pressure from both sides was immense. She loved her brother, not just as family, but in the romantic sense that Hawaiian culture had prepared her for since childhood. Yet she had also been taught by missionaries that this love was forbidden. The conflict destroyed her. At 19, she was forced into a political marriage with a high chief named Liliuhoku, a man she did not love. But she continued her relationship with her brother in secret. When she became pregnant, the entire Hawaiian court waited to see whose child it was. Rumors spread. Missionaries watched with judgment. Traditional nobles hoped for a sacred Niopo birth. Nahianaena gave birth to a son in 1836. The child lived only a few hours. Whether the infant died from genetic disorders caused by inbreeding or from complications of a difficult birth, no one recorded with certainty. What is certain is that Nahianaena fell into a grief so deep she never recovered. She died just months later at age 21, her body weakened by childbirth and her spirit broken by irreconcilable cultural collision. The last real hope for a traditional Hawaiian sacred bloodline died with her and her infant son, buried together in a Christian cemetery that represented everything her culture had lost. Nahienai and his brother, Kauikolai, outlived her by nearly 2 decades. He ruled as Kamehameha III until 1854, presiding over Hawaii's transformation from an independent kingdom into a constitutional monarchy, increasingly dominated by Western influence. But he never recovered from losing his sister. He never produced a legitimate heir. The man who was supposed to father the most sacred child in Hawaiian history died childless, his bloodline ending with him. The tragedy was not unique to this pair of siblings. Hawaiian oral histories and genealogies reveal that the practice of Naiopio unions, while celebrated, rarely produced successful lineages. The children of such unions often died young or failed to reproduce. The very quality that made them sacred, their concentrated bloodline, made them biologically fragile. Traditional Hawaiian chiefs kept detailed genealogical chants called Mil Koihonua, reciting ancestry back dozens of generations. These chants reveal a pattern. Naiopio births were rare even before Western contact. The Alai attempted such unions repeatedly across the islands, but successful cases where the children lived to adulthood and produced their own offspring were exceptional, not common. The practice existed as an ideal that reality rarely achieved. What makes the Hawaiian case uniquely tragic is the timing. Unlike the Ptolemies, who practiced sibling marriage for centuries before external forces ended it, or the Habsburgs, who gradually realized their mistake, the Hawaiian Alai lost their tradition right at the moment of cultural collision. They never had the chance to abandon the practice on their own terms, or to see its biological impossibility play out across enough generations to understand it naturally. Instead, Western missionaries condemned them morally while offering no understanding of the genetic reasons why such unions failed. The Hawaiians were told their most sacred tradition was evil, but not given any scientific framework to understand why their Nio children so often died. They lost their belief system without gaining knowledge to replace it. Other Hawaiian nobles tried to preserve the tradition in modified forms. Cousin marriages continued. Uncle-niece unions still occurred. But the pressure from missionaries and American business interests made even these practices increasingly untenable. Hawaii's annexation by the United States in 1898 formally ended any remaining traditional marriage practices among the nobility. The genetic legacy, however, remained. Medical records from the late 19th and early 20th centuries show that descendants of the Alai, even those from less extreme inbreeding, suffered higher rates of certain genetic disorders than the general Hawaiian population. The concentration of bloodlines that was meant to concentrate divine power had instead concentrated genetic vulnerabilities that would affect families for generations. Kauikoli died at age 42, his health failing from years of alcoholism that began after his sister's death. He had tried to escape his grief through drink, through work, through diplomatic efforts to preserve Hawaiian independence. Nothing worked. The brother who was supposed to father gods with his sister instead died alone, without direct heirs, having watched Hawaii's traditional culture crumble around him. The last true Naiopio attempt ended not with scientific understanding or natural conclusion, but with a Christian burial of a heartbroken princess and her infant son, both victims of a culture war they never asked to fight. Long before missionaries arrived, before Western ships appeared on the horizon, the Alai of Hawaii had been practicing strategic inbreeding for centuries. The tradition stretched back to the earliest Polynesian settlers, who arrived in their voyaging canoes around 1000 AD. They brought with them a social system that divided people into rigid classes, and at the very top sat those who could claim the purest bloodlines. The concept made sense within their worldview. In Hawaiian cosmology, the gods had created the islands and the first chiefs from divine unions. To maintain that divinity, to keep the connection between heaven and earth strong, the highest chiefs needed to replicate those original sacred relationships. Brother-sister unions among the gods were celebrated in Hawaiian chants and legends. The alai were simply following the pattern the gods had established. But practical politics also drove the practice. Hawaii was not one unified kingdom originally. It was multiple chiefdoms spread across the island chain, constantly competing for resources and power. A chief with highly concentrated bloodlines could claim superiority over rivals. The Niopio child represented the ultimate trump card in political negotiations. Other chiefs would have to acknowledge the superior mana of such a being. Archaeological evidence and genealogical records suggest that the practice intensified in the centuries before. Western contact, particularly on the Big Island of Hawaii, where the most powerful chiefdoms emerged. As competition for dominance increased, so did the pressure to produce increasingly sacred offspring. Chiefs who might have previously married high-ranking cousins now felt compelled to arrange sibling unions to maintain their family as status. The physical toll appeared in ways the Hawaiians could observe, but not fully understand. Children born from such unions were often described in oral histories as having unusual features or being physically delicate. Some traditional chants mention chiefs who were carried everywhere, who tired easily, who seemed to possess great mana but weak bodies. The Hawaiian phrase for these sacred children, Niapio, literally refers to the arch of the coconut frond, possibly describing a curved or bowed posture that may have been common among them. Infant mortality among the highest alai was significantly elevated compared to common Hawaiians. Families would attempt Niapio unions, lose children in infancy or early childhood, and sometimes try again. The pattern repeated across the islands. Each island's ruling family maintained their own genealogies, and those records show numerous instances of sibling marriages, producing children who disappeared from the genealogical record after only a few entries, suggesting early death. Yet the practice continued because the few successes were celebrated so intensely that they overshadowed the many failures. When a Niapio child did survive to adulthood, they became the focus of enormous political and spiritual attention. Their every action was interpreted as manifestation of divine power. Their presence at ceremonies legitimized political decisions. They were living proof that the gods still blessed the alai. This created a feedback loop where the rare successful cases reinforced the belief system, encouraging more attempts despite the overwhelming evidence that such unions rarely produced healthy, fertile offspring. By the time Kamehameha I unified the islands, and his children faced the choice between tradition and missionary teaching, the practice was already doomed by its own biological impossibility. By the mid-19th century, the practice that had defined Hawaiian nobility for generations simply stopped, not through legislation or formal decree, but through a quiet cultural surrender. The last serious attempts at Niapio unions had failed. Nahainaina was dead. Her brother ruled, but would produce no heirs. The younger generation of alai, educated in missionary schools, married outside the traditional system entirely. The shift happened within a single generation. Chiefs who had grown up expecting to marry their siblings or closest cousins instead married Westerners, or chose partners from less closely related noble families. The genealogical chants that once celebrated the most concentrated bloodlines began emphasizing different qualities: diplomatic skill, education, ability to navigate the changing political landscape. Mana became less about genetics and more about adaptability. Some alai families tried to preserve remnants of the old ways through cousin marriages, maintaining some degree of bloodline concentration without the extreme risks of sibling unions. But even these practices faded as Hawaii's integration with the Western world accelerated. The children and grandchildren of the last generation of traditional nobles often married Americans or Europeans, diluting the concentrated genetics that had defined their class. What remained was a cultural memory tinged with tragedy. Hawaiian elders in the late 19th century, interviewed by anthropologists, spoke of the Niopo tradition with a mixture of reverence and quiet acknowledgement of its costs. They remembered the sacred children who died young. They recalled the grief of families who lost infant after infant trying to produce viable heirs. But they also remembered the belief system that had made it all seem necessary, even beautiful. The Hawaiian case stands apart from the European dynasties and the Ptolemies in one crucial way. It ended before completing its full cycle. The Habsburgs bred themselves to extinction over 16 generations. The Ptolemies lasted 10 generations before their line collapsed. Egypt's 18th dynasty destroyed itself over 5 generations of extreme inbreeding. But Hawaii's alai were interrupted mid-process by external cultural forces that ended the practice before it could run its full biological course. We will never know how many more generations the Hawaiian nobility could have sustained Niopo unions before the genetic damage became as catastrophic as Charles II or Tutankhamun. The missionaries who condemned the practice saw it as moral intervention, saving souls from sin. But they were unknowingly also preventing what genetics would have eventually forced: the complete biological collapse of Hawaii's ruling class. Today, descendants of the alai carry the genetic legacy of those centuries of concentrated breeding. Some families show higher rates of certain inherited conditions. Others seem to have escaped the worst effects through the dilution that came with later generations of outmarriage. The sacred bloodlines that were meant to preserve divine power instead became case studies in what happens when human populations violate the biological need for genetic diversity. The story of Hawaiian royal inbreeding is not about evil or cruelty. It is about a culture that developed a belief system that contradicted biological reality and paid the price in dead children, broken families, and ultimately the loss of the very tradition they were trying to preserve.